the acoustics in here are actually quite good. It's very nice. I am going to start off with a story of dismemberment. In the late 1500s, the hot technology was something called the pamphlet. We dismiss this today as a trivial piece of trash you might find in Kinko's if you happen to go to actually need to print something. But in the late 1500s, this was a rising form of technology for people who had ideas. The government was not a fan of pamphleting, but they were slowly learning that they had little control over how this technology was being used. And it was common in the late 1500s in England. This photo is from the mini-series The Virgin Queen, which is about Queen Elizabeth I. And executions were common. It was common to be tried in what was really a kangaroo court. There was not really a lot of actual debate going on in these courts. It was largely what the monarchy wanted, whatever they wanted would happen to you, which meant there were a lot of executions, there were a lot of hangings, a lot of people who were sent to the Tower of London for indefinite imprisonment without any recourse. So it was a difficult time to be a person with ideas. But this technology, this hot trending social media tool called the pamphlet was rising in power. That's the first story I want to tell you to help explore this notion of what free speech means and how it impacts or doesn't the impact of the social media mob, people's ability to respond to things in the way that they want. There's a guy named John Stubbs who doesn't show up much in history, but I think he's fascinating for use as a case study in this presentation tonight. He wrote a short pamphlet. Pamphlets, by the way, were these short little 5- to 10-page documents. They were printed relatively inexpensively. They weren't that cheap, but comparative to how printing had been done for hundreds of years, they were really cheap. So for the first time, ordinary citizens who had opinions about what was going on in government, or in their society, or in their culture, or in their profession, they were finally getting a voice. So more and more people, including this gentleman named John Stubbs, were deciding to spend their own money simply to share their ideas. He wrote a pamphlet that had a rather unfortunate name. And they hadn't yet learned about how to make good titles that would be trending on media outlets. And the title for his pamphlet was The Discovery of a Gaping Gulf Wherein England is Likely to be Swallowed by Another It was 30 words long, which was really a disaster as far as titles go. But they hadn't learned the art of this yet. You guys, as many of you know, many of us today have not learned the art of making good titles yet. The thrust of his pamphlet was a critique of the Queen and the prospect of her finding a marriage partner from some other nation to bond the two nations together. This is a common formation of marriage. It was used for political purposes to help align one nation with another and protect their general prospects for survival and advantage relative to other nations. He had an unfortunate phrase that he put in this pamphlet, which did not put the Queen, who, as I mentioned before, had great authority over your survival, did not put her in the best light. He had this phrase, and referring to the prospect of her marrying someone else. An immoral union, an uneven yoking of the clean ox to the unclean ass. A thing forbidden in the law. Now, although he refers to the Queen as being clean, calling a woman an ox in 15th century England or 16th century England, especially the Queen, was a mistake. So what happened was largely not really a surprise, given how many executions there were. They rounded up, and by they I mean the police, the Queen's Guard, they rounded up the writer, John Stubbs, his publisher, and the printer under threat of execution. They eventually decided to let the printer go, which I think is fascinating, that even in this time period when printing was so new, that social media giving people the right to publish, or the ability to publish, was so new, they let the printer go, which basically establishes the fact they recognized that printing was mechanical. It was a technology that simply someone operated, and the choice to print or not, he was just trying to make a living. But the publisher, who helped to fund this pamphlet, and the writer, who chose the title and the contents of it, were put on trial. And they were found guilty. They were threatened with execution. Eventually, a debate went on in the court, and it was decided they wouldn't be executed, instead of a different fate, which may be more devastating to someone who's interested in writing. They took John Stubbs and put him up the executioner's block, his right hand on the block, and took a cleaver and put it in between the joints of his wrists, and with 3 pounds in the mouth, they chopped his hand off. Which seems horrific. Horrible. Dismembering a person for exercising an idea, having commentary on what was going on. Now, I share this story with you not to make you uncomfortable, not to make you feel that somehow before you leave I may put you on trial for what you say or don't say on Twitter about my particular talk tonight. That's not why I'm saying it. Just to offer some context, historical context about this question of free speech. Many talks about this issue, or many talks in general, have some core thesis that's in the title. My core thesis was, can free speech survive the social media mob? And I want to cut to the chase, which is something that's rarely done in these sorts of talks, and tell you the answer to the question. And the answer to the question is very simple. The answer is yes. Of course. Go back further through history. So my story is from the 16th century. So we've been counting centuries, far longer than that. You can go back in time and pick up stories of great leaders and writers and thinkers, religious leaders, spiritual leaders, political leaders, who decided that despite the consequences for their actions, they were going to speak freely anyway. In many cultures and tribes and religions, that's the definition of a martyr. That's what saints do. They recognize they will be stoned or persecuted, and they speak up anyway. So free speech, I believe, is inalienable. Not inalienable in the sense of any legal construction, but inalienable because you have a mouth. And before someone can hit you in the face with a stone or a stick, you can speak, provided you're willing to deal with the consequences. So the fundamental answer to this question is it's inalienable. Beyond government, beyond punishment, beyond prison, beyond new forms of torture, there will always be the ability to speak freely provided you are willing to pay the price. That price may not be losing your hand. That may be being ostracized from your community, from your neighbors, from your coworkers. Maybe you get fired. Snowden is a fascinating example in this context. He was fully aware of all the consequences of sharing documents that he chose. He chose to speak freely anyway. So I want to start with that as a fundamental premise. Free speech will exist no matter what goes on. I'm not going to talk too much more about it because I don't think that question itself is that interesting. Regarding social media and technology and what's happened in the last 10 years, there's many interesting sub-questions that have come up, and that's where the focus of my talk is going to be. There's a lot of history in published literature for writers, especially in the Western tradition, the American tradition. Writers who don't talk about this very much, but the stuff that we now applaud them for, they wrote anonymously, or they wrote in exile. They recognized the risks of what they had to say. They realized they wanted to say it anyway, and they fled. Or they wrote under a nom de plume. One of the most famous ones regarding our tradition, the American tradition, is Thomas Paine. The book, or the pamphlet, Common Sense, was written anonymously. That may be the most significant book in the history of America, because it catalyzed American attitudes towards being pro-revolution, recognizing that there was a large mass audience of people who shared the same opinion, that maybe there's a better way for us to relate to government. And that document was initially published anonymously. Eventually, once he gained fame, he published more and more pamphlets, and he took his name and took ownership over that. But when it was initially published, it was done anonymously. So it's a huge tradition of writers who decided, you know what? I don't care about the consequences. I'm aware of them. I'm going to publish anyway. I'm going to flee my country. I'm going to flee my homeland to write a book or make a pamphlet or say a statement that I hope will have an effect on where I just left. I'm not writing about this about where I'm going. I'm trying to contribute about where I had just fled. That's a fascinating bit of philosophy and psychology, to be willing to be that committed to an idea to pursue it to that level. So there are 6 questions I'm going to explore. My talk is about 40 minutes long. If you're looking at the clock and trying to figure out how long is this guy going to rant for, about 40 minutes. We'll have time for Q&A after that. There are 6 questions I'm going to explore. I'm going to actually try to answer these questions at the end. But I'm going to share with you some stories of the last 5 or 6 years about social media and use those stories as examples to help us sort out how all this stuff works. It's very difficult to talk about free speech without talking about the First Amendment. We're very proud of the First Amendment in this country, despite how few people have actually read it. There's a tradition I have that I'm very fond of promoting, which is on July 4th, before I blow stuff up and get drunk, I go and read the Constitution. Now, getting drunk and blowing stuff are very admirable things to do, provided you're not hurting anyone, you're not blowing up other people's stuff. I think it's a good thing. But the Constitution helps establish the framework for all of the stuff that we're so angry about. All the stuff we're so angry about. Why is half the country so stupid? And depending on which side of that you're on, it's a different group of people you think are stupid. But we all tend to think that half the country is just completely moronic. The Constitution, I believe, every time I read it, and I forget this over the course of a year, but every time I sit down to read it, I'm reminded, you know what? The people who wrote this knew that we'd hate each other. They knew we wouldn't agree, and that's how the Constitution is constructed. So I strongly recommend that once a year, before you get drunk and blow stuff up, on July 4th, sit down and read the Constitution. The Constitution's about 5,000 words long. That's about 40 tweets. 40 tweets! If you can't read that when you're frustrated about the state of the country, I think the problem is not about the country, the problem is about you. So that's my one recommendation. If you can learn nothing else tonight, once a year read the Constitution. Anyway, First Amendment. So the First Amendment, if you look at it, and I'm not a congressional scholar, I'm not a legal scholar, but I've read the Bill of Rights many times. The First Amendment, we tend to throw that around as this granting of rights. First Amendment, free speech, I'm granted this because of free speech. Well, the first sentence of the First Amendment says, is a withholding. It's a withholding. It says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech. It's saying what the government can't do. It's a withholding. Government can't comment on this. You are free, but it's not telling you, yeah, go and make pictures of yourself making dinner, or go and post on Facebook. It's not saying anything at all. It's a withholding. It doesn't say what the consequences will be for you if you speak freely. It doesn't say how you have to deal with your neighbors if you speak freely. It doesn't say how to deal with your peers in your profession if you speak freely. It says nothing. It's completely indifferent about that. And if you want to dig into the history, there's a whole long history of legal cases that try to frame and point out different substructures of what it actually means or it doesn't. But the First Amendment itself says very little. It just says the government can't get involved. And it's important to recognize that. Now, what does this mean to me? I think, in the context of this talk, who is in charge? The government says we can't get involved, so who's in charge? Well, we are. That sounds awesome. This is the Greek democratic ideal. We're in charge. We get to decide who to sue, and we get to decide who's on the jury. We get involved in all of these things to help vet out all the details. But at the same time, we all kind of think, not all the time, but a lot of the time, we're all kind of frustrated at the state of the country, or the state of the world, or the state of social media, or the state of your company, the state of your neighborhood. We complain a lot. And so the question then is, well, why does it suck? And I think the answer is because we're crazy. Like, as a species, we're messed up. We are not sane. We're kind of cuckoo. And we're all crazy in different ways. And we're really good at pointing out everybody else's craziness and really bad at recognizing our own. And this is not the focus of the talk, but I think there's tons of great examples about human failings. We're all very emotional creatures, but we judge everybody else purely for rational reasons. So we see people overreacting online or on the web or in our family, go, wow, what's up with her? And we have this very judgmental relationship with the rest of the world, and a very judgmental relationship with ourselves. That polarity, I think, defines a lot of the chaos we see with our friends on Facebook and Twitter and online. This huge dichotomy between how we consume other people's behavior and how we assess our own. And it goes on, and there's a long list here. I think generally we're very lazy. I'm sure a lot of you probably skip to the bottom of this list. We don't read very well. We assume reading comprehension is like a standard when we know in our own behavior it's not. We skim for like the salacious words and we focus on those things. We have other crazy stuff in this country. Columbus was a jerk. He was really a bad guy. He still gets a holiday. Like, how does that go on? That's just madness to me. The inherited tradition, the assumptions that we just assume are true because someone decided 200 years ago to honor someone, I think we have tons and tons of examples. So I think a fundamental thrust of my talk today is that we like to point to technologies. Certainly skeptics about social media like to point to Twitter or Facebook as the decline of Western civilization. And I think the reality of it may be we're just being exposed to more of the truth about how we really are. And it's terrifying. And we're not equipped for how to deal with it. So that's my sort of jumping ahead. About political discourse, this comes up a lot about how Twitter and Facebook have made political discourse worse. A great case study is the 1800 election between Adams and Jefferson. Adams and Jefferson are two of our founding fathers. The 1800 election was one of the most contentious and dirty elections in our history. It was horrible. They did lots of really nasty things. That's not to say that all elections from 200 years ago were that bad, but this serves as an example to us, and a reminder to us, that maybe what's going on now isn't something inherently new. It's just a different flavor of something that's been moving and shifting through our culture and through our nature for a very long time. There's another thing that I want to point out historically, which is this term yellow journalism, and it's something you learn about in your high school history course very briefly about the 1800s. It's useful to look at earlier forms of media to help us understand new media. That's probably my greatest critique about people who are social media experts or social media advocates, is we act like this is the first time we've ever had a new media. And that's not true. We've done this many, many times. And it's particularly illustrative to study the history of newspapers. Newspapers, in many ways, echo what's going on now in the blogging world, the media world, where there's these new entrants that are trying to consolidate power and gain more attention to become major brands. That happened before the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal became major brands. They were fighting for territory and for attention in the same way that bloggers do today. And there was this term that was popularized at the time called yellow journalism, which was a slanderous term. It meant journalists who are not actually trying to report the truth, but journalists who are merely trying to gain attention for their brand. And they would do whatever they could. They would make up stories, they'd doctor photos, they would jigger headlines. The definition from Wikipedia says this: yellow journalism is a type of journalism that presents little or no legitimate, well-researched news and instead uses eye-catching headlines to sell more newspapers. Techniques may include exaggeration of news events, scandal monitoring, or sensationalism. So think of your Twitter feed, think of what goes past your Facebook news, your blog readers. And this doesn't sound all that strange. This sounds very familiar. I like to say there's a term for yellow tweeting. People who engage in using media for the same agenda. They have a brand they're trying to promote. They have an agenda that's purely about self-interest, and they're using the tools of media to promote that thing. I think it's fascinating to look at what goes on in social media from this lens. That if you look historically, we said this was a really bad thing, that journalism got perverted in this way. But the lens that we look at media today, we become maybe so skeptical, so jaded, we don't see these things as being unusual or unfair or bad practices at all. From recent history, I know there was this image that was popular in my own particular Facebook news feed. I didn't see it that much on Twitter, but on Facebook I saw it probably a dozen times. And it had the headline, how many of you have seen this picture? Just reference, about half of you. Okay, good. The headline that I saw, China started televising the sunrise because their smog is so bad. That was the headline. And people were like, oh, the world is going to shit now. Like, look, even China, they've realized now how bad their smog is. And this is a half-truth. Like, the image is a real image. It's actually, for one moment in time, this was an image on a Beijing street. But the truth of the story, which eventually, if you're patient enough, some media news outlets do take the time to go and try to reflect back on what's going on today. I mean, this is like the headline says it all. Beijing is not really the sun. This is not really the sunrise not really showing it because of pollution. It turned out that these huge screens were showing ads. One of the ads on the screen was a tourist ad for like a tourism bureau. So they showed lots of scenes that were beautiful. And is pollution in Beijing bad? Yes, of course it is. But that's not why this image existed. So this is a collusion of facts and picking the most sensational way to describe a story as the first choice for how the stories are reported. Misrepresenting information and sensationalizing stories and offering headlines that are designed to get the most attention is not new. This is very old. This goes back through all of media. It goes back before newspapers, the pamphlets. People always were seeking attention for whatever they did. But I want to offer you a theory which is useful to know as people who are practitioners or even users of any kind of publishing media. And that's this. The misinformation and these deceptions, these tweaks that we do, they live on for a really long time. They're like ripples in a pond. That when some event happens, no matter what the motivation was, it could be unintentional. Unintentionally, you got a fact wrong. It could be very intentional. You got a fact wrong on purpose because you're trying to make someone look bad. In all cases, they're like ripples in a pond. That information goes out into a broader and broader circle. And you may come back later, someone may come back later and correct the fact, but that misinformation goes on for a very long time. And the freedom to speak doesn't come with a license where you're aware of the negative ramifications of all this power. So I have this little thing I think to myself as a writer, that misinformation lives on forever, and it's fueled by our desire for efficiency. When we come across someone else's misinformation, it's not labeled as misinformation. We're looking for a fact to tell our own story. So we'll grab the first fact that we find and fit it into our story. But hey, look, that fits, boom, move on. And we've taken that little bit of misinformation, and now it's gone on. And that will go on forever. We'll go on to the end of time. There'll be some person who finds that piece of misinformation that was copied and copied and copied, and no one did the due diligence to say, where did this come from, who is the source? A fascinating way to exemplify this, not all facts work this way, but the way people are quoted is fascinating to study. So here's a very popular quote, you'll see it on Twitter like once a day. Be the change you wish to see in the world, Gandhi. People see that in their Twitter stream or on Facebook, oh, that's awesome, yeah. And I love Gandhi. Gandhi's great. Great tweet. Sounds like something Gandhi would say. Not that I ever spoke to him, but hey, sounds like Gandhi. On and on and on. No one goes, when did he say this exactly? Did he write this? Did he speak this? Was there an interview? Just give me some link. Give me some, like the book it's from. Not even the page number. Just give me the book it's from. He never said it. He never said it. Sorry, he never said it. The quote itself, the sentence, is perfectly valid, but not the person who said it. And you can make an argument, does it really matter that much? Well, it depends on how much you care about specific facts, and depending on how you're using it, maybe it does matter, maybe it doesn't. So you can find tons of examples of this just for quotes, which is just a sentence. This is one sentence of information. There's a website that I use called Quote Investigator that actually does the due diligence on these quotes. So you can go there and have a field day on Facebook of going, hey, he didn't say that, you can be that guy on Facebook. I am one of those people, by the way. I am like a Snopes.com junkie. I'm always a little goofy stuff, like Snopes, like their website's kind of crusty. I'm a little concerned that the basis for our certainty about knowledge comes from a website that looks like that. But yeah, I know. You know them? If you know them, I don't know.
I've tried to sell them.
I know. Anyway, so it's not that, well, my point for showing this website, it's not very hard today to do due diligence on almost any fact. It's a Google search. Now it's not even a Google search. You know the site to go to. It's one step less. And most of us have little interest in doing this. We feel like it's, why would I bother? I'll just retweet. I'll just let it go. I'll talk more about that in a second. I have to mention confirmation bias. It's part of the story about free speech and about how we use media and how we use our privilege or our ability to speak. And that is this notion of confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is a cognitive bias. It's one of the most common ones. And basically what confirmation bias means is that we always have a lens on the world. There's some agenda that we have. The agenda could be as simple as wanting to be smart. It could be that you're trying to prove a point. It could be you work for a group that's advocating I don't know, better environmental practices or animal welfare. It could be almost anything. We have an agenda on our minds. Confirmation bias is we'll do research up until the point we get something that confirms our point of view, and then we'll conclude our research and say that we're done and use that as our fact. We found the thing that validates our premise and we are done. And we do that all the time. We all know people on Facebook or Twitter or on their blogs that they have an agenda. And all they do is fill that agenda with stories that fit that framework again and again and again. And that means that anytime you consume even any story, it doesn't matter what the story is, you may have no context in the story. Your lens on that story is, how do I fit this into my agenda? And that is done at the level beneath your active consciousness. We have a bias inherent in us that fuels us to do this. And even if you're, this is one of the really messed up things about cognitive biases. Even if you're aware of confirmation bias, you do it anyway. You do it anyway. I said before that we're crazy. This is one of the examples of how crazy you are. You may know about confirmation bias, you still suffer the same thing. So that means that any story that goes by, anything you're coming in contact with, the lenses by which you are evaluating it have bias in them. And as I'll talk more about some of these examples from recent social media history, that's part of what explains mob behavior. Every one of us acts in this way that is vulnerable to mob behavior because we are looking for something that satisfies an agenda that we already have. And as I mentioned, the agenda itself could be benevolent. You want to save the animals. You want whales to be treated better. You want better environmental practices. You want higher minimum wages. But the fact about how you manipulate stories and how infrequent it is and how poorly a job we do at evaluating our own biases is something that's very difficult to get around. The last thing before I talk about these examples, this is still my opening preamble here, is about this notion about retweeting. There's something controversial I could say today. I think it's probably about retweeting. And this is a common thing that people who are on Twitter in particular, but the same thing, some people have the same policy about Facebook. It's like, hey, if I retweet it, doesn't mean I endorsed it. I just passed it off. FYI. You should know, don't blame me for what's in it, but look at it. Like, what? How could you possibly do that? There's only one I've come across of someone who has a more accurate statement policy about retweeting. He says, all retweets are explicit endorsements of genocide. Which I think is hysterical and bizarre, but more accurate in a way. To disclaim something that retweets are not endorsement is a lack of understanding of what the word endorsement means. There are many layers of endorsement. There are many levels of endorsement. The most obvious one is for me to say, hey, you know, John, Sally, I read this thing. I think you should read it. That's what most commonly we would think of as an endorsement. I'm saying, this is good for you. I think it's good. I've read it. You should read this. That's a personal endorsement. Some level below that is, well, yeah, I read some of it, and I'm not sure about what it means, but it's interesting enough that you should look at it. That's like level 2. Level 3 is, I think, what the disclaimer tries to get around any sort of personal responsibility for, which is, I'm guessing by the title, this is interesting, so good luck. Good luck. I saw the title, I think it fits my agenda, therefore I'm going to send it to you, and now you're going to look at it and figure it out for yourselves. That's still an endorsement. The only way not to endorse something is not to share it. I don't have a problem with people who say, I retweet stuff without reading. That's fine. Then that's what should be in your profile. I retweet stuff I have not read. Way more clear than this. Retweets are not endorsement baloney. So that's my own pet peeve. Some of you may have that in your profile. If I offended you, I want to say I'm sorry, but really not. I think it's part of the problem. At least be honest. It's okay to do that, but be honest about what you're doing. I retweet stuff and share stuff I have not read. Which honestly is probably true for like 90% of the population. Alright. Now I get to the meat of my talk for you. I'm supposed to talk with social media mob. So I have 5 or 6. Whoa. What was that? Sorry. That's right. As long as that was a scream of pleasure of some kind and not anxiety or anger, it's fine. Alright, so let's go through these. I got 5 or 6 of them. These are all complicated issues. Hold on. So look, these are all complicated issues. And I have done a fair amount of research on all of them. I am not an expert on them because they are multifaceted. However, I'm going to use them as an example to help answer some of the questions I raised earlier. So I'm going to give you a 1-minute encapsulation. It's not going to be perfect, but I'm going to try to be balanced about these things. So Justine Sacco, she tweeted this tweet before she got on the plane. She didn't have that many followers, maybe 1,200, 1,500 followers. She tweeted this, she got on the plane, and very quickly people picked it up and created this. They knew she was on a flight because her other tweets indicated she was getting on a plane to South Africa. And they had created this hashtag because they knew she was on a plane called "Has Justine Landed Yet?" And that amplified the whole story. Because now more and more people who had never heard of her before, this is the only tweet of hers they've ever read or ever seen. And now it became their introduction to this person. And out of context, it was meant as a joke. It's a tasteless joke, but many of the jokes we tell each other in private, in confidence, in person, with a group of people we know, are tasteless. So she meant it as a joke. But to people who had never seen anything from her before, hadn't looked at her stream, in their agenda, in their context, it was very offensive. So this very large set of people who had never met her before started tweeting about her and to her. There were threats of rape, threats of killing her. It's pretty disgusting and horrible. As bad as you think this was, the response was much worse. And it was amplified by the fact that she was not online. There are all these other side stories that took place. People contacted her employer. Apparently, I don't know if this is entirely true or not, someone went to the airport she was going to land at and interviewed her. So all this stuff happened that was just completely insane. Completely insane. So that's story number one, Justine Sacco. She was fired. She apologized. It's a very nicely written apology. She meant it as a joke. She didn't expect that thousands of people would be looking at it. As most of you probably don't expect thousands of people would look at your Twitter post or blog post. Her little thing was taken and became a much larger thing. It says Justine Sacco, that's the first one. Domogate, this is number two in my list of examples. So Domogate, Adrienne Richards was a tech evangelist. I forget the company she worked for. She was at a conference called PyCon, a relatively well-known conference, large conference, or maybe 800 people in the audience. And during a session, she overheard a conversation behind her that was offensive to her. The details of that conversation, it's still complicated to figure it out. You can find many different accounts of what was said or wasn't said. Some sort of joke was made about dongles, size of dongle, and another joke was made about forking repos. Forking being a term used to, when you divide a code base into two, you make two copies of it, you fork it, and a repo is a code repository. So some commentary was going on behind her that she found offensive. She stood up and turned around and took a photo of them and posted this tweet. Now, there's a dozen different issues that are all compressed down to this moment. There's a very large issue going on in the tech sector right now. You could argue it's an issue in the whole workplace about gender issues and how difficult it is and how uncomfortable it can be for women to work in the tech sector. And I think it's a totally valid issue. There's other issues that come up once this tweet was created about the rights of people taking pictures of people and accusing them of things or not accusing them of things. This became very complicated very quickly. And so for many people, this was their introduction to Adrienne Richards. This was their introduction to the situation. Was one photo, one comment, and it became a very large thing. All sorts of issues now, different people's agendas, whether they were for improving gender diversity at conferences, people who were defensive about gender issues, people who had issues about public photographs, all that got loaded down and compressed down to this one photo. It became a big deal. She was harassed, threats, very sexist, horrible threats. I didn't want to include those in this presentation, but horrible stuff. It's all online. You can find it if you really want to find it. Eventually, her website was denial of service attacked. Someone took down her website. She did contact, after she posted, she did contact the organizer of the event. The people in the photo were talked to, and there's a whole internal discussion that took place within the conference about the issue. And but the net result at the end, she was fired. One of the two people involved was fired from their company for participating in this. One of them did apologize on Reddit. It's a whole very complicated thing that was a result of a single tweet. If you're interested in learning more about women's issues, the best article I've seen about women's issues in the tech sector is this one, Why Women Aren't Welcome on the Internet. Despite your point of view on this, I recommend that you read it. It's the best encapsulation I've seen recently. There are problems with the article, but all articles have problems, and I recommend that you read it. I think it should be standard reading among anyone who works in technology or the tech sector. Next example, I think I'm going to go through these quickly because these are more well-known public examples. The Newtown shootings and a whole bunch of Twitter and Reddit followers who tried to participate in the investigation of who the shooter was. And it's very complicated to sort out what happened, but to give you the most salacious or most interesting details, the Newtown shooter was a guy named Adam Lansing? Sorry? Lanza, thank you. Adam Lanza, his brother was named Ryan Lanza. At some point, Ryan's name entered the Twitter and Reddit sphere as the possible suspect. So people went on Facebook and found his photo. It got posted on BuzzFeed. It turns out that Brian was his brother and was not actually involved, but Brian was mentioned as the first suspect, and a whole ton of attention came directed at him. Eventually, that reached CNN, and CNN was reporting that he was the shooter, which led to Brian on his Facebook account saying, "Fuck you, CNN, it wasn't me," which I think in the history, like 30 years from now, this will be like a landmark. Communicating to CNN from your Facebook account about the erroneous charge against you for a crime that you committed. It's hysterical to me and also just terrifying. It's just bizarre. Because we talk about the whole context tonight is about free speech. The ability for someone to communicate with CNN, or try to communicate with CNN through Facebook is just seems really confusing. I don't fully understand what it means. Later on, I mentioned the ripples in the pond. Right, the ripples in the pond. So the first thing you do, the first ripple goes out to the widest ripple. BuzzFeed did come around later and recognize they made a mistake. The New York Times, CNN, they all recognize they made mistakes. But those mistakes come much later and are given far less attention. Newspapers that I mentioned are 160 years old, 170 years old. They publish their mistakes and retraction on like page 6. They publish the headlines about photo of Boston Marathon bomber. They publish those on page 1. There's a different amplification that we get for being the breaking of a story versus being telling the story of actually a correction or something that went wrong. The last two are similar. This was the George Zimmerman Trayvon Martin case. Reddit and Twitter had a bunch. Actually, I'm not sure Reddit was involved in this, but Twitter definitely was. Trying to figure out who George Zimmerman was when his name was mentioned in the shooting. They tracked down. A bunch of people tracked, well, George Zimmerman, can't we put addresses are public record? Let's find where George Zimmerman lives. They found the address of a George Zimmerman, they posted it on Twitter. And people were retweeting the address of someone that may have nothing to do with the crime, who just happens to be named Zimmerman. George Zimmerman. Turned out it was wrong. Spike Lee was one of the people who retweeted this. And eventually he apologized. He was sued and apologized for retweeting this thing. Boston Marathon bombing had some similar things happen. I'm not going to detail those. Another one you may be familiar with is Amazon Fail. Clay Shirky was involved in this one. The story there was that a bunch of authors of books about gay-themed adult novels, it seemed like they were being targeted to get less attention on Amazon.com. And so a whole bunch of people got involved in trying to figure out what's going on. Clay Shirky was one of the people involved, and he wrote a very thoughtful apology about how he got caught up in his agenda for trying to defend his rights and how good it looked that the story was true and it turned out to be wrong. It's a great article that he wrote about that. The last story I want to share with you in these examples, before I give you my rundown on answering those questions that I started off with, is this photo here, which was taken by Lindsay Stone. And it was a photo she took on her personal Facebook page. And I take lots of goofy, so snarky, sarcastic kind of photos. And to me, that's what this looks like. It was actually at the National Cemetery in Arlington, which is a famous cemetery for military personnel who died in wartime, who died in service. And she posted on her personal Facebook page, and somehow, I tried to figure out exactly how this happened, but somehow it became far more public. I don't know if that was because she didn't have good control of her permissions. Do you know?
She published it public.
Oh, it was public?
Yeah.
Okay. So she published it publicly on her Facebook page. That may have been her ignorance about exactly how people could see. Maybe it was intentional. I don't know. But it got picked up, and eventually a large group of people created a separate page on Facebook asking for her to be fired from her job because she was there in Washington, D.C. on a work-related trip. And there's some horrible, nasty stuff that page started to say about her. They made all these caricatures and drawings about her that were personal ad hominem attacks that had nothing to do with their inappropriate nature. These were sexist and very personal attacks that they made, which are, I don't know, there's really nothing good to say about these things. What I think is interesting in this context about thinking about free speech is that this, to me, is really connected to political cartooning. And political cartooning is a very long history. This is a political cartoon that was made by Benjamin Franklin during the Revolutionary War. And this was basically a cartoon that was meant to be shown to citizens of the Northern United States yet, citizens who were in the colonies, British colonies, trying to get them involved in the Revolutionary War. And the cartoon is pretty intense. Like, join or die. Join or die. Now that may not mean we're going to kill you, but it's pretty suggestive that it's kind of a threat. Benjamin Franklin, under the context of having a political agenda. And the connection with the Lindsay Stone thing is political cartooning has a long history of doing very intense, almost, well, not almost personal, very personal attacks. This is a political cartoon from the 1850s or so, and it's an attack on Democrats. So if you look carefully at the belt, you can't really see it because of the projector here, but the belt that the devil is wearing in this picture says Democrats on it. So it's meant to be an attack on Democrats for being too liberal in their spending. You're going to paint the town red to spend money. It's the devil's work to spend money from the Democratic point of view. That's what this cartoon means. And if you look carefully in the paintbrush at the top, I don't remember who the president was, but there's actually a profile of the president in the brush. So it's meant to be a personal attack on the Democratic president of the time. You can find tons and tons of these intense, really intense, personal attacks on political figures throughout American history. This goes back hundreds of years, taking physical features of people who are public figures and using those to make fun of them. So the Lindsay Stone thing, there's a connection to history about having opinions about actions people take. But what's very strange about it is Lindsay Stone didn't intend to be a political figure. She didn't intend to be a public figure. If what you're saying is true and she had the public setting on a Facebook post, she still never really intended to enter the public sphere. She wasn't trying to just for personal advantage. But there's some connection now. Somehow publishing and exercising your free speech puts you now in the same domain that public figures have been in for a long, long time. That's a scary, unusual place for ordinary people to be. So this is my rundown chart on all of the examples that I've used. And again, each one of these are complicated stories and there's many facets to them. And I acknowledge in a chart like this, I am not capturing the nuances of them. But to give some perspective, you can see, in most cases, there was some attempt at correction by whoever posted the thing. In all cases, at the moment the thing was posted, the AIDS joke Donald gave, the person who posted the thing was threatened and harassed. In many cases, the Boston, the Newtown case, the Zimmerman case, someone who was identified by the mob, effectively, was harassed wrongly for a time, and then eventually was corrected and it faded away. But this should give you some context out of these. I really wish there was a website that had all these stories and gave you some kind of chart table. I couldn't find one. I figured for sure someone had done this already. I couldn't find one. So I invite all of you. This is incomplete. I'd love to fill this out and make it more detailed. And if you'd like help with that, you should ping me on Twitter, and I could use your help. I'd love to make a much more elaborate reference point for other people who want to explore these issues, and we get some starting point for how to frame them all together. So that's really what this chart is for. Okay, so let me get to the questions. This will take 5 or 6 minutes to run through these questions, and I'll open the floor for Q&A. So number one was, how has new media changed access? I think that the most important thing that's changed is it's fast and free now. I mentioned pamphlet. This is 1575. And people who chose to could publish whatever they want and get in a lot of trouble for it. So the notion that we're terrified, oh my God, if I tweet this or if I Facebook that, the notion is old. And the challenges are old. The opportunities are old. We've been dealing with this for a very long time, almost 500 years. What's different is now the speed at which you can do it, how easy it is to do it when you're intoxicated or when you're inebriated or when you had your idiot friend convince you to do it. You can now do it really quickly, so you can get in trouble more quickly, but the fundamental principles are the same. From an idealistic perspective, this is great. All the people who are kumbaya about social media, this is awesome. We finally get to see what everyone's thinking. This will be wonderful. At the same time, all the skeptics and cynics are like, this is horrible. Now we need to know what everyone's thinking. I don't want to know what everyone's thinking. Most people are morons. Most people suck. I don't want to hear from them. So it's bifurcated. The technology doesn't care about your point of view on this. It enables the same abilities to everyone. So really, I think I'm on the latter half, or not the latter half, I guess the former half. I think this is welcome your species. We're an opportunity to be more exposed to really what our species is about and all the many facets of who we are and how we express ourselves and how we deal with power. Because being able to publish is a kind of power. How is it better and worse? I think this is sort of a moot question. All technologies are double-edged. The technologies are amoral. They don't care about your morality. They don't care what you think. They don't care what's right or wrong. They just do things. And we have a fascination in America, certainly in Western culture, with technology. We believe that every problem we have will be solved by an upgrade, or a better phone, or a new app. That somehow there's a technology that can save us. And I don't think that's true. I mentioned from the beginning, we are crazy. We have problems. We have personal problems. We have problems getting along with each other. There's no technology that can save us from that. I do think technology can make us more aware. I think it'd be great if Twitter and Facebook had like a launch control button that required you to, push it twice, or maybe a 5-minute delay before that photo went out on Twitter. There are things we can do that allow us to recognize our own failings, and technology can help there a little bit, but fundamentally, we have problems that are social and philosophical. So all these tools, all these things, whenever a new technology, there'll be some new thing that comes along that replaces social media. There will be. People will say, this is the solution, and it won't be. Because all that this stuff does really is let us do more of whatever we put in the blank. And it's up to us to decide that. Morality will never come from a machine. And this comes back to the mob mentality. This is something I've been dodging for most of the talk, but like, what does a mob even mean? What is that really? And when you look at the definition of a mob behavior, it comes very close to community behavior. So I'm not saying they're the same, but it comes close. When you're part of a group, people lose self-awareness, and that can be a good thing. When you're at a rave or a rock concert, you're a part of a group, and that feels good. There's an emotional energy you get from that. You can't get any other way. You feel connected in a deep and sometimes very spiritual way. And that can be a really good thing. You're often able to access behavior you wouldn't do normally, which can be a good thing. Maybe you'll try something new. Maybe you'll have the confidence or the courage to do something that you wish you could do on your own. Maybe. You also feel kind of anonymous. You feel safe. No one knows your name. So you can do things and not feel like you're being judged. Or you simply know that you're entering a context without any prejudgment. For the same reasons that travel is a great personal development thing. You go to a place where no one knows who you are. There's no backstory for you. That's possibly an empowering thing. But depending on your point of view, whether you're a part of a group or not, it either seems like a mob or it doesn't. So in recent history, you go to a sporting event, like the recent Seahawks game, and it's people rallying and screaming, it can feel empowering. It's a great feeling to be in a stadium of 60,000 people all cheering for the same thing. It could be a spiritual experience. A rock concert with similar stakes involved. However, if you are a 49ers fan in this building, it's a very different experience. Crush them, kill them. It becomes something very terrifying now if you're not part of that community. It becomes something that you feel threatened. In many stadiums, Seattle, I think there weren't that many stories of violence against 49ers fans, but it's not uncommon in sporting events for people to get into fights because someone wore the wrong jersey. There's a lot of history of tribalism that gets manifested here. War paint, and signs, and the chants, and the rituals. You go back a little too far in history, this is when people got dismembered and sacrificed, and a lot of the things are similar. I am very glad that the plan isn't to dismember anybody, which is what it used to be. It's now just more theatrics, but there's something thematic that's very similar. The same thing is true for the Sherman interview. It's very polarizing. If you're a Seattle fan, or you're in Seattle, you saw this thing, you want to defend it. Well, he's a good guy. He went to Stanford. If you're anywhere else on the planet, this guy was a ranting maniac. Which is true? Well, they're both true. Your context, your point of view defines a lot of how that particular moment in history, what it means to you. I mentioned before about advocacy, confirmation bias. If you're a Seahawks fan, if you're a 49er fan, if you're a Denver fan, these things mean very different things. And it's a trap that's very difficult to escape. So, last few questions here. What are the challenges that we're facing? I don't think these challenges are new. I think they're old challenges that we're rediscovering. I think the most interesting thing is that more of us are now being exposed to it. Stubbs got exposed to this in 1575. More and more of us now exposed to this on a regular basis. It's part of how we communicate with our friends. It's part of how we engage with our own local communities. So it just means more and more of us are being forced to deal with these challenges. Implications for you. I think you really should, I said this before, I really think you should retweet what you share. You should always be asking, what is the source for this? You don't even have to read the article. You can go and click on the link and scan the article and see what did the person write in this article, what is their source? Did they even mention one? Lots of times they don't. If you don't mention your source, you're kind of making it easy to be discredited. That's a really low bar. If you reference a source, because you can reference a source not even having read it, right? I'm one of these insane people. I will never link to an article about a study. Studies say eating 6 oranges a day will double your height, whatever. I read the study, because most of the time the person writing the article, even for like New York Times or whatever, didn't read the study. So I jump to the study, I read the conclusions that this guy who wrote the study said, and I compare that with what the article says. And I wish it was an app. This is the thing that should be an app for. Like, go to the PDF from the university that published the study, pull out the conclusion and look at the headline. Because a fair amount of the time, they completely disagree. And the person who wrote the study claims that you should not make claims like the person who wrote the article about it later actually said. Let's see. Last couple things. So I spent a fair amount of time this week trying to find legal support. What is the legal system doing about protecting people from social mob attacks and denial of service attacks and harassment? And there are slowly starting to become case law and reports of people who were put on trial or accused or held accountable for what they tweeted about. There are slowly starting to be examples of this, and there will be more. The Courtney Love one is probably the most famous one. She defamed, I think, a fashion designer, or just ranted about their work online, and he sued her, and they settled out of court, probably for hundreds of thousands of dollars. That's a very unique case because it was someone who's very famous criticizing someone who's less famous, but it sets some kind of precedent. And that will continue. But the legal system is always, I think by design, slow and trails culture. It trails society. So a lot of people who are like, why isn't there a law? Well, there isn't a law yet because you're still on the frontier of dealing with these challenges. To that, on the positive side, most states today in the United States have laws about cyber harassment and cyberbullying. Many of these laws are not tested yet, they're not well tested yet, but the laws exist, which means there is a protocol for a lawyer or a person who feels harassed to go and find a lawyer and file a suit based on these laws, and that's a very good thing. That's one of the things in all the research I did for this talk we feel optimistic. There's now some structure and some skeletal underpinnings of trying to prevent people from making, or holding people accountable who abuse their ability to speak freely and to publish online. And I'll wrap up. These are all the images I used and most of the references that I had. I will post these slides later tonight. They're not online yet, but they will be. And with that, I will say thank you and answer your questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Let's give him a big round of applause. I'm always fearful that I'm going to tweet something that's going to cause the mob mentality to go crazy. So far, I'm good. You'll let me know if that changes. So we're going to take questions now for Scott. We have a couple on the social media channel, but in the meantime, if you have a question, please raise your hand. I'll be happy to come to you with a microphone. Let's wait till the microphone gets to you so that those watching it bit.ly/SNC Live, see what I did there? So those can hear the questions as well. Who has questions for Scott? I did the Josh. See, look, Josh has a question. See what I did there? Hang on a second, let's get over to you. First of all, you have to give us a shameless plug and tell us your name and your Twitter handle.
Yeah, you pressured me into it. It's Josh King. It's at Joshua M. King. I'm a lawyer at avo.com. But my question for you has to do, your original example had to do with anonymous pamphlets. So what about anonymity online? And how would you tie that into some of the themes you talked about here around, especially around accountability?
There's no, I have ambivalence about my answers to most of these things. I think anonymity is important for the reasons I just described. That you always need the ability to publish things where you feel safe. I think the recognition that the person who's commenting or saying something is anonymous and it's not an actual person or it's a false name, maybe that's something that should be recognized. You can be validated. I mean, Twitter kind of does this in a way. They do verified accounts. They ask the question, well, why do they do that? Well, because there are people who are pretending to be someone else. Let me back up. The right answer is, I think the consequences of making anonymity illegal are worse than having them. It does suck when someone on Twitter harasses you and threatens to kill you and you can't sue them because it's an anonymous account. That sucks. And that's wrong. And I think 5 years later, or if they talk to their mom about it, they're going to feel really bad about what they did. But to force everyone to have to identify themselves sets us up for the trap of what Thomas Paine and the people who wrote anonymously on purpose were had to work around, which is they felt so terrified to speak what they thought was the truth that they had to be anonymous. So I think it's two ends of a shaped stick, and you pick which one. Either one has problems. I don't think there's an answer. And if you have to get a proposal, there doesn't be a middle ground where there's some way to allow anonymity or to minimize or require registration for it, because it all kind of defeats the purpose of allowing it to begin with. So that's my answer. I think it's if you want free speech, part of that's going to come with the ability for people to speak freely. Because even if I think you don't want it, you'll get it anyway. People will find a way to be anonymous. I don't know how you can prevent it. You're a lawyer, so you may know more than I do. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Are we trying to? I can repeat the question.
I can also bring you.
Okay.
Yeah. Stand. Oh boy, he's put on the spot.
So my question is, why isn't there a wikibunk.org? Why are we still reliant upon Snopes or the Sherlock Holmes site? It seems like there's a huge market for truth finding, and it's not being filled. The question is why?
Yeah, it's a great question. I joke about Snopes in part because I have the same concern that you do. Why isn't it an open source? Why isn't it? And I'm not accusing the Wikimedia Foundation for failing here, but it seems like something that would be very natural for them to try to do. I think the answer is, and I'm making this up, I haven't thought about it too much. The answer is what is truth? So many of these things are become very subjective, and you look at the edit logs for the contentious pages on Wikipedia, and you start to get a sense for why it's so challenging to have one central authority. I don't understand why Snopes.com doesn't get more attention positively, and more attention for why are they not more popular, why are they not more utilized, why don't the BuzzFeeds and the daily newses in the world reference them more? I don't have an answer. There's a book to be written about the history of Snopes. Why some I don't want to call them oddball, that'd be offensive. And they may be upset and be harassing them for saying such thing. But there's something odd, it's they're off in the corner, and they're well known in a way, but in a way that they're not. It's an interesting story to me.
But do you think that Snopes would not be as well known if they were, or not taken as credibly, if they were trying to be about themselves and not about the product they put out, the information they provide?
It could be. At the same, I'm very conflicted about this. I think Snopes is great. At the same time, I've read 1984, and I saw Brazil, which they had the Bureau of Truth. You know, it's like the Bureau of Truth is a bunch of morons, like telling you that you're lying. You know, it's like, what? And as soon as you try to formalize things too much, you run into the opposite kind of problem.
Another question, Joe?
So, you know, I have the background of probably contributing to large crowds of people online towards common good, I hope. What do you think, where is that fine line between between a mob going after a public figure or an entity to change their mind about something they're doing versus a mob who is perceived as threatening or part of the problem that you're trying to address here?
That's a good question. I think one thing I learned in doing all the research I did for this talk was about threats. And that seems a very clear, obvious line to me. When you are threatening someone with physical harm, when you are taking down someone's website and preventing their ability to speak freely, that has to, I have this, the word un-American gets thrown around all the time in all sorts of ways. They're really not un-American. By virtue of the First Amendment, they're not un-American. To prevent someone the ability to speak, I think it's definitely un-American. It's the First fucking Amendment. For me to go decide on my own that I'm going to shut down your, so I think that's the red line. I think fighting for a cause, as long as you're not shutting down the opposition, as long as you're not preventing the opportunity for some debate, you're entitled to your opinion. You're entitled to invest your money, your time to make that opinion valid. I just wish that there was more opportunity and more platforms where there was discourse and Oxford debates where the two sides got together on a fair platform where they got to, hey, you get a half hour, we get a half hour, we'll invite all of our community to come, and the two leaders will say, we believe in discourse. I think that is really the ideal.
So you want a fair platform, do you feel like Twitter is a fair platform?
It depends. I think if you have two vocal groups that have an equal following, then maybe it's a fair platform. If I disagree with you on some issue, and you have 500,000 followers and I have 5,000, it's not a fair platform. If you have, your budget's 10 times mine, it's not really a fair platform. It may be fair in certain ways that I have the ability to speak, and if my words are good enough, I'll develop that following. But Twitter there's so many variables on Twitter, depending on who's, and not even your follower count. You guys all know this. I may have 1 million followers who don't ever go on Twitter. Like, what does that number mean? Or maybe my Twitter followers go on at night, and I post during the day. Like, there's too many variables to call it
Geography.
fair. Yes.
More questions here? Let me get you to row 4. I'll get there. Hang on, I gotta walk all the way back to row 4. Here we go. I'm gonna run next time.
Yeah, I'm Michael Sheldon. I'm a copywriter, so a lot of my clients do a lot of nitpicking, so I want to return the favor with you right now. On your table, the consequences for some of those people were that they were wrongly harassed. Oh, okay. And does that imply that there's a rightful harassment that's different from wrongful?
That's a good
That's
question.
a good point. I think you're totally right. I think at some point I had wrongly accused and I changed it to harassment because, thank you for the commentary.
So is it possible they were just simply harassed rather than wrong or right?
Yeah.
I mean, Michael has a really good question, and I think that in
I don't
some
know-
respects it's splitting hairs. But
Yeah, I honestly don't know what the right chart is. I showed a chart that tried to give you a landscape. The categories might be wrong.
I don't think it's like the apology for getting the address wrong, where he was sending people. It was that he was inciting a mob to go to the house of a person who was already in the legal system and confront that person.
Thank you for the commentary.
Other questions? Right here, let's go to Chris Burgess. Which means after we through row 5. This is still first class, so it's all good.
It is first class. We have the big seats here. Very good presentation, Scott, and I enjoyed the, thank you, I can swallow this, I guess. Great presentation. The context is the United States. We all know that social networks are global, and so we get into a discussion that transcends borders. And I can say something, and you can say something that perhaps our interlocutor sitting in China can't. Or perhaps our interlocutor sitting in France has a different opinion and views ours as you say, crazy. So have you come up with a chart that shows the freedom of speech around the world in the context of the Twitter battles?
I haven't. I can say that the Wikipedia entry on freedom of press is comprehensive in that way. It's listed by nation, and it gives you the differences. And in some ways, the United States isn't the most liberal about freedom of press, which is a shock. I was surprised to see that, but it's true that there are other nations, Western Europe being where you'll find most of them, that have far more protections for free speech than we do. So that would be the first place I'd start to come in with a chart like that. I've yet to see that chart mapped to social media in any way, but that'd be a fascinating project for someone to do. It's like a great student project.
Any interns in the room? Social Media Club Seattle could take on an intern? I tried. With good effort, no takers. Do we have, I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions, if there's something you've been dying to know. Hang on, there's this awkward moment. Normally we have two people running mics. Hey, here we are. Go ahead, Kevin.
My name is Kelly, and I've been thinking a lot about the mob mentality and sort of our accountability in terms of truth and citing our sources, and thinking about what happened with the Boston Marathon bombing, the people listening to the police scanners and sharing misinformation, and did that have an impact on the search for the suspects, yes or no? That could be maybe debated. So I just would love to hear your perspective on access to information and what's the accountability there, either from a government standpoint, because we definitely have an accountability from a truth standpoint.
Yeah, that's a great question. A slide I skipped over, which I just went back to, that is, if I could give you one link about that, to answer that question, it's this one. So Reddit is a managed community, it's an anonymous community, but some of the visible leaders are well known. This was written by Eric, who's one of the leaders in the community, about his reflections on everything they learned from Reddit's involvement in the marathon bombing. And it's a great read. It's very thoughtful. It's very detailed in his analysis of what they did right and what they did wrong, and recommendations for what he'd like to see the Reddit community do next time. Now, what's interesting for this, I think it's interesting just to read, given what you know, that they got some things wrong that led to some people being harassed. But what's interesting about this is that this is a process that every major blog will go through, in the same way that every newspaper went through this 150 years ago. Newspapers had the same problems. And they had to sort of have, what's the craft, what's the craft? If there's any old school journalism people here that say, see, if we protected our newspapers, we'd have, this would never happen. We wouldn't have to relearn these lessons. But this is an example of relearning that lesson, about having a community of people who are not trained in vetting sources, are not trained in being careful and cautious, and have all that emotional energy about, oh, we're going to find, oh, I found a fact, without any of the wisdom to counterbalance it. That's what happened. So they've learned. Their leaders have learned. And I think next time there'll be a more useful resource, or a wiser resource. So I think if I couldn't give you a specific answer from myself, go read that article, because that will reveal to you lessons that a lot of other sites haven't learned yet. And hopefully we'll learn from their example.
Speaking of learning, I just want to clarify, I made a comment about interns earlier. I actually have a lot of respect for interns because in a lot of cases they're the ones that do the real work. We were all interns once. Also, I read an article today about the most popular piece of content on the New York Times website last year was created by an intern. Sherry Reynolds asks, do we live in an era where everyone's opinion carries equal weight and expert knowledge no longer matters?
No.
Okay, we'll move on. Any other questions?
I think that it's higher variability in how we define who's credible or not.
Sure.
Anyone can have a web page. Anyone can go pay someone to make a nice theme for them. It's a lot different than having a storefront. You've got to spend a lot more money to do that. So you do have to depend on your own judgment more in some ways, but if you're hiring someone to do a service for you, and you know what you want, it's pretty clear to learn whether someone's competent to do that for you or not. So I don't think expertise is dead. I think expertise is different, and expertise manifests itself differently. I think there's a certain segment of people who, I'm 41 years old, so I was on the cusp. I was 20 years old when the web began, so I knew before then, I know after then. There's an old guard that's even my age that thinks everything's gone to crap. But you can go through history and find that for people before the newspaper era, or before the telegraph era, or before the phone era. I think that the people who are most afraid of that fear, who think that expertise doesn't mean anything anymore, are those who aren't willing to participate in how things have changed. And it's not that scary. It's not that hard to make a web page. It's not that hard to be on Facebook. It's not that hard to be on Twitter. At least participate enough so your expertise, if you're really an expert, can show.
Well, and Laura just mentioned that there are more projects that you've thrown out to the room than there are times in the day. So I feel like there's going to be 77 more startups tomorrow as a result of your ideas.
I'm a writer. Just
throw them out there, right? Any more questions? One last question. Let me get over to you up here.
Hi, I'm Sandy Olsen at Sandy O'Sandy. And talking about the Boston Marathon, I remember when it happened that I had a lot of people on my Twitter feed tweeting and retweeting, hey, did anybody notice that this is not a Muslim name? So that brings up the question, in your research, did you find situations in which the mob mentality was beneficial or positive?
It's both. Mob is a bunch of people. In any mob, no matter how violent, someone's going to be the least stupid in the mob. There's going to be one person who's the most sensible out of all the idiots in the mob. They're going to say things that are useful, but they may not have said if they hadn't convened as a mob. So it's hard to come up with a an answer about all mobs throughout time and all history. Like I said before, the line between a mob and a community, a flash mob that forms, it gets fuzzy. And like I said before, when you're threatening people with violence, when you're saying people shouldn't speak, you're shutting down their website, that crosses a certain line. I think violence and threats are definitely, that falls into the category of hate speech, and that's where mobs go too far. But in the playing field before then, there's lots of rooms where mobs formed for any number of reasons can do good things and can bounce ideas off each other and come to conclusions that you wouldn't have come to otherwise. This post does talk about a lot of those things, including how they came to the wrong conclusions and whatnot. So again, I would point you to this article. It's not that long, it's very well written, very thoughtfully written. It's probably one of the better things I came across in all this stuff, because you had an insider in a group that was heavily criticized for, it's probably the most visible Reddit has been in a long, I mean, they're becoming more and more visible, but this was like a pinnacle for them in terms of their national visibility, and they got a lot of criticism, and they took it to heart. So I recommend that you read this.
All right, well, I'd like to give a big thanks to Scott Bergen. Let's give him a round of applause. Thank you for his time.